So I'm a transport researcher, and I sit in this uneasy place where I'm also a climate change researcher. And it leads to some embarrassing conversations with students and with rooms like this, where I have to admit that transport is known as the roadblock to climate change mitigation. That's not to say there aren't things happening, and we've heard about different technologies, different innovations, different ways of doing that potentially offer opportunities, but to date we're not seeing an awful lot of change happening in transport. And as a transport researcher, that's somewhat embarrassing. There's no historical precedent for the types of changes that we require. In transport, we have seen fundamental change over time, but we haven't seen it in the speed and the scale that we're requiring at the moment. So transport must be part of any attempt to limit greenhouse gas emissions. Efforts must be done, however, and I'm sure we will hear from our next panel, with more than climate in mind. So many of the solutions that we're hearing about at the moment have other consequences that we need to be thinking through as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those over the next couple of moments. In his most recent writing, Frank Giles, who is one of the co-directors of the Centre of Innovation and Energy Demand, discusses whole system changes. And he says that we should be thinking beyond individual niches and starting to think about how things come together. So how we think about collections of niches, innovations occurring, new things that are happening, and how they might affect lots of different systems. And we've heard about the connection between the systems from the previous two speakers. It's really important. Hearing about housing and buildings is so exciting when you hear from Transport for London to know that they too are thinking how all of these things connect together. But Frank also calls for this multi-source view of change that is perhaps incremental as much as it is radical. So why am I talking about this? Because the field of transport is currently hugely preoccupied with three innovations. With electric vehicles, which are often viewed as one kind of innovation when actually there's an awful lot going on there and huge diversity in what they can do, and their various infrastructures, which I should say I get very excited by infrastructure. I teach about infrastructure and I get really giddy about it. So maybe I can tell you why I'm so excited about that later. The second is automated vehicles, which again get spoken about as though they are one kind of innovation, but we already have automated vehicles to some degrees today. And there are hugely diverging visions of what that future might look like. And the third is practices of sharing, from sharing artifacts to sharing spaces. Innovations in electrification, automation, and sharing need to be thought about together. They're undoubtedly related to each other and have implications for one another, but they shouldn't be conflated, as they are in many depictions and many visions that we see today. Assumptions about their contributions to low-carbon transitions are often based on poorly understood understandings of behavior, of social dynamics, of deeply held values and norms that are part of how we are mobile. This isn't to say that these behaviors and practices don't change. We've seen practices change. Benjamin spoke about some of the radical innovations, the things that we couldn't have forecast, and how much they have had implications for how we travel at the moment. But the jury is still out on whether these sorts of values, changes, practices are going to occur in the timeframes that we really need them to. Moreover, often the low carbon and energy demand reduction benefits of these innovations are based on other types of innovations. So when we talk about automated vehicles, the benefits that we're hearing about demand that they are shared. Yet quite often we're not talking about whether people will be willing to share. We're not talking about ownership. The fact that we're going to need people to not own these vehicles is a far bigger feat in my mind than the technological capability to make a vehicle autonomous. But we're not talking about that. We're only talking about the benefits that they might offer. So I'm going to talk about two things very briefly now before I hand the floor back to Benjamin. As I said before, we need to think about the unintended consequences of the technologies, the policies, and the practices. For example, the excellent work of Steve Sorrell has told us about the rebound mechanisms, the things that might happen in practices that we might not foresee, that we might not think about when we're designing technologies and policies. There's also questions of the spatial scale of innovation. We hear so much about electric vehicles, but what's happening to our internal combustion engine vehicles? Where are they going? If we're sending them to other countries, quite often we're sending them to less wealthy countries, we're just offshoring our emissions. Those emissions are still happening. So we need to think about what's happening with our current vehicle fleet before we get too excited about encouraging electric vehicle uptake. The second is from my own work and my work with Tim Schwanen on vehicle automation and experimentation in the UK, and it looked at Greenwich and Oxford and the types of experiments that are happening there. And from that research, I want to highlight the importance of the public and thinking about the public in its many diverse ways, that they're not just people that are going to receive these technologies, but they're a very important and diverse group of many types of people, and they need to be part of the experimentation process. And at the moment, the UK is patting itself on the back very often around these different types of experiments that are happening, but the public are not involved, and they are only seeing a very staged performance of these innovations. And I think that if we want them to be successful, if we think they are going to be part of our future, we need to be taking people along with us too. So in sum, decarbonising transport is of critical importance if we are going to meet any of the targets that we have set for ourselves as a country and if the Paris Agreement is going to be achieved. Thinking about innovation and low carbon measures as more than technologies, thinking across systems and beyond silos, and accounting for the types of diversity that occurs is going to be of critical importance. Thank you very much.